My name is Christopher Green, and I've been a reporter for over 2 decades. I've covered everything from political scandals to high-profile crimes, but lately, things have gone south for me. One bad call, a story that didn't pan out, and I've been clawing my way back ever since. That's how I found myself digging into a story no one else wanted. Factory closures, industrial towns decaying in the Midwest, shuttered factories popping up all across the country since the 1920s. It wasn't glamorous, but I needed a win, something to get me back in the game. It started with a lead in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Old reports about a factory that closed abruptly in 1933. Nothing strange at first glance, but the deeper I looked, the weirder things got. There were rumors, workers falling sick, strange incidents before the place shut down. Documents buried deep in local archives hinted at something more than just a financial collapse. I found letters, old, yellowed paper with cryptic references to unexplained illnesses and disappearances. Scranton was just the tip of the iceberg. I found the same pattern in other cities: Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo. Factories closing without warning, workers vanishing from the records, and always the same whispers of something happening just before the shutdowns. It all pointed back to one organization, KGO. I'd never heard of them before, but their name kept appearing in connection to these closures. Funding, contracts, legal agreements, KGO had their hands in all of it. I figured it was corporate corruption, another big company covering their tracks, pushing out workers and pocketing the profits. But something felt off. None of the paperwork made sense. No lawsuits, no media coverage, no public outcry. It was as if these places had just vanished. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something big, something that went deeper than just bad business deals. By the time I got to Detroit, the story was already spiraling out of control. I found records from a closed steel mill that shut its doors in 1939. The official line was bankruptcy, but buried in the company's records were memos, urgent, desperate, warning about unexplainable symptoms in the workers. The memos described men and women collapsing on the job, their skin turning pale, eyes glazed over, muttering things that didn't make sense. These weren't accidents. Something had been happening inside those walls, and it was clear KGO knew about it. They were part of it. That's when I hit the first real wall. Every time I got close to something concrete, the trail went cold. People I tried to interview wouldn't talk. Some didn't even show up for the meetings. Then I started noticing things. My apartment broken into, files moved, things missing. I knew I was getting too close, but by then it was too late to back off. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was something darker, something I had to see through to the end. After Detroit, things started getting strange. It wasn't just the files that seemed out of place or the interviews that fell through. It was me. I felt like I was losing control, like the story was crawling under my skin. I'd sit in my apartment late at night, poring over old documents, and suddenly notice I'd been staring at the same sentence for an hour. I'd walk through the city and catch glimpses of people watching me, faces I didn't recognize but swore I'd seen before. The walls were closing in, and I wasn't sure if it was the investigation or my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to push through it. A good reporter knows when to shake off paranoia, right? I booked a trip to Michigan after hearing about Eloise Psychiatric Hospital. The place had been abandoned for decades, but I came across a few references in old KGO documents. Something about medical trials during the 1940s. It didn't take long to find rumors about unethical experiments and mysterious deaths. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this was where the real story began. When I got to the hospital, it looked worse than I imagined. The walls were crumbling, windows shattered, graffiti covering most of the exterior. It didn't feel like the kind of place that held answers, but I wasn't leaving without something concrete. I made my way inside, the air thick with dust and decay. Old medical records, broken equipment, even patient beds. It was all left behind like someone had just walked out one day and never came back. I found a room on the third floor that looked different from the others. Cleaner somehow, like it hadn't been touched by time the way the rest of the building had. Papers were scattered across a desk, old folders stacked in the corner. Most of it was technical jargon, but buried deep in one of the folders, I found it, a memo from 1953, stamped with the KGO logo. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but it sent a chill through me. The subject's reaction to the virus is alarming. Uncontrollable aggression, heightened strength, insensitivity to pain. Terminate all further testing. Secure the facility. I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was reading. A virus? I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. This was the key to everything. The strange illnesses, the factory closures, the disappearances, it all came back to this virus. My hands were shaking, and I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. KGO had been experimenting on people, workers, families, and they had tried to cover it all up. Before I could gather my thoughts, I heard something. Not a creak or a rustle, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone else was in the building. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. The sound of those footsteps rooted me to the spot. They were slow, deliberate, too steady for an old building settling. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. That was worse somehow. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears, trying to drown out the fear creeping into my bones. I had two choices: stay put and hope they passed, or confront whoever was out there. Neither seemed like a good option. I grabbed the memo and shoved it into my jacket, the paper crinkling in my shaking hands. Every instinct told me to hide, but where? The room wasn't exactly filled with options. A desk, a few cabinets, nothing big enough to disappear behind. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing down the hall. My mind raced, and before I could talk myself out of it, I slipped into the small closet on the far side of the room. The space was cramped, filled with old medical supplies, and the smell of mildew hit me hard. I tried to breathe quietly, listening as the footsteps grew louder, clearer. I didn't dare move, my back pressed against the cool metal of the shelves, fingers gripping the door handle from the inside. I could feel my pulse thudding in my chest, every heartbeat a reminder that I was trapped. I wasn't sure who was out there, but something told me it wasn't someone I wanted to meet. They stopped just outside the room. The floor creaked under their weight. I held my breath. Closing my eyes for a moment like that would make it all disappear. The door to the room swung open with a low groan. Whoever it was stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity. I could hear them breathing, steady and calm, as if they had all the time in the world. The air was thick, suffocating, and I had to force myself not to cough, not to make a sound. The sound of slow footsteps moved across the room, pacing. Whoever was in there was looking for something or someone. My hand tightened around the door handle, knuckles white. I wasn't sure what I'd do if they opened the closet. Fight? Run? I couldn't even think straight. The footsteps stopped again, this time near the desk where I had just been standing moments ago. There was a soft rustling, papers being moved, then the sound of something heavier being shifted, maybe a drawer. The tension in my chest built, like a rope being pulled tighter and tighter. I wanted to scream, to burst out of there, but I didn't. I waited, every second stretching out until it felt unbearable. Then, just as slowly as they came, the footsteps retreated, first across the room, then out into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind them. I stayed there for a few minutes, breathing hard, waiting for the footsteps to fade completely. When I finally emerged, my legs were weak, shaking. I didn't care anymore about being careful. I just needed to get out of that building. Whatever I'd just stepped into, it was bigger than a few missing workers or strange illnesses. And now, I was in too deep to walk away. I stood there for a moment, heart still hammering in my chest, trying to convince myself that it was safe to move. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get the hell out of that hospital before something worse happened. But the rational part of my brain, the part that kept me digging into stories like this, whispered that I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Whatever I'd just encountered wasn't random. Whoever was out there had been looking for something, or someone. Maybe they didn't find it this time, but if I stuck around, they might. I forced myself to walk, one foot in front of the other, muscles tense and ready to bolt if I needed to. The hallway outside the room was empty, but it felt wrong, too still, like the place had been holding its breath, waiting for something to break. My eyes scanned the length of the corridor, landing on a set of rusted double doors at the far end. That was my exit, but something told me there was more I hadn't seen yet. The memo in my pocket was a clue, but not the whole story. What the hell was KGO doing here in the 50s, and what did it have to do with the virus mentioned in those cryptic files? I had to know more. I made my way toward what looked like an old storage area, hoping to find another piece of the puzzle. The floor creaked under my weight, and every sound I made seemed to echo down the hall, bouncing off the walls like it didn't belong there. The door to the storage room was stuck, swollen from years of neglect. I put my shoulder into it, forcing it open with a groan of metal against wood. Inside, it smelled like mold and decay, the air thick and damp. I shined my flashlight over shelves stacked with old medical equipment, boxes of syringes, dusty bottles, strange contraptions that looked more like torture devices than anything a doctor would use. I picked up a file that had fallen to the floor, the cover worn and faded. The file was marked Project Genesis. My stomach knotted as I flipped through the pages. There were charts, notes about subjects, showing violent behavior after being exposed to an experimental serum. One line stood out. Subject displays no reaction to pain stimuli. Aggression uncontrollable. Further testing required. It was dated 1952, but the implications were chilling. This wasn't some old, forgotten experiment. The way the language was written, the urgency in the notes, it felt like they hadn't stopped, like they were still working on this. I slammed the file shut, my hands trembling. KGO wasn't just responsible for factory closures. They were hiding something darker, something they'd been perfecting for decades. That's when it hit me. These weren't accidents. The people who'd gotten sick, the workers who disappeared, they weren't victims of some virus. They were experiments. I started backing toward the door, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. But as I reached the hallway again, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the far end, motionless. My heart seized in my chest. It wasn't moving toward me, just standing there, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I froze, eyes locked on the figure at the end of the hall. They were just standing there, unmoving, a silhouette against the dim light leaking through broken windows. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to think, to keep breathing. This wasn't some shadow or trick of the mind. Someone, something, was there. My body tensed, ready for whatever came next, but they didn't move. I could feel the weight of the Project Genesis file in my hand, its presence burning like a warning. This was why I had come here. This was the truth I had been chasing for months. But now, faced with the reality of it, I wasn't sure I wanted to know anymore. The experiments, the virus, it wasn't just some forgotten piece of history. It was alive, still happening, and whoever, or whatever, was in front of me was proof of that. I took a step back, careful, trying to stay calm. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, watching, as if waiting for me to decide what to do next. My mind raced, running through possibilities. I could turn and run, but something told me that wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't about getting out. It was about what I just uncovered, and the fact that I wasn't supposed to leave this place with that knowledge. I took another step, and that's when I heard it. A low, almost inhuman growl, like something deep inside the figure was struggling to escape. My stomach twisted. That wasn't the sound of a person. It was something else. Something that wasn't right. I tightened my grip on the file, adrenaline flooding my system as I backed up further, my eyes never leaving the figure. The growl grew louder, more ragged, like it was coming from a throat that shouldn't be able to make those sounds. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't want any trouble. I'm leaving." My words felt hollow, like they didn't belong here, like this thing wouldn't understand them anyway. It didn't respond. Just that horrible guttural noise, followed by a sharp inhale that made my skin crawl. I felt the panic rise, but I couldn't give in to it. Not yet. I turned, making for the double doors at the other end of the hall, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a run. If I ran, it would follow. I knew it somehow. My hand hit the door, pushing it open, but just as I stepped outside, I heard it behind me, the unmistakable sound of something large, heavy, barreling down the hallway. Footsteps, fast and erratic, gaining on me. I ran, my breath coming in short, frantic bursts. The parking lot was ahead, my car just a few yards away, but the sound of those footsteps stayed with me, like whatever it was had no intention of letting me leave. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking too much to get the damn door open. For a moment, I felt like I wasn't going to make it, like I was about to be pulled back into that nightmare. But I got the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. The last thing I saw, through the rearview mirror as I sped away, was the figure standing just outside the hospital, watching me. It didn't follow, it didn't need to. I had the file, I had the truth, and now I had something else. A feeling that whatever KGO had started, it wasn't just locked in that hospital anymore. It was out there, and no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I knew it would come for me next. My name is William Carter, and if you're hearing this, you need to know one thing. I didn't imagine any of it. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't losing my grip. It started off as something small, just a blip during a routine audit. I've done these checks hundreds of times for Vanguard Technologies, digging through logs, looking for anomalies in data access. Most of the time it's boring, numbers, dates, IP addresses. But that day, something was different. I noticed a few logins that didn't make sense. Access times in the middle of the night, entries without matching credentials, and connections from locations that were off. It was subtle, like someone had tried to cover their tracks but didn't quite manage to erase everything. Maybe they got sloppy, or maybe they didn't think anyone would dig that deep. Either way, it was enough to raise a red flag. I remember sitting there, staring at the screen, trying to figure out what I was looking at. It didn't feel right. I flagged the logs, pulled the access history for the past 6 months, and ran a deeper search. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard. I didn't know it then, but this was the moment, the point of no return. Once I hit that search, I wasn't just looking at an anomaly. I was stepping into something bigger, something darker. The data started to pile up on the screen, line after line of unauthorized access. Whoever it was, they'd been inside our most secure servers, the ones storing classified projects. New surveillance technologies, prototypes, experimental stuff, the kind of information that should have been locked tighter than anything. That's when the questions started swirling in my head. How had I missed this? How had we missed this? Vanguard had some of the best security protocols in the world, and I'm damn good at my job. Yet here it was, laid out in front of me. Someone was inside, manipulating data, and no one seemed to notice. I leaned back in my chair, eyes scanning the room, half expecting someone to walk in and tell me it was a mistake, that I'd gotten it wrong. But no one did. The office was as quiet as ever, a room full of analysts focused on their own screens, oblivious to what I was seeing. I didn't tell anyone, not right away. Something in my gut told me to keep digging before sounding the alarm. Maybe it was the fear that I'd found something bigger than just a breach. Or maybe it was the creeping realization that I couldn't trust anyone yet. The more I looked, the more I found. Altered files, erased logs, incomplete records. It wasn't just one breach. It was systematic, deliberate. Someone or some group had been inside for months. By the time I left the office that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Not in the physical sense, but in the way the data seemed to move just out of reach every time I tried to pin it down. Like it was alive, reacting to me. I walked to my car, keys in hand, feeling the weight of the discovery settle over me. There was no going back now. Whatever this was, it was bigger than I'd thought, and I had a sinking feeling that I was already in too deep. The next morning, I walked into the office with the same nagging thought from the night before. How deep does this go? I kept my head down, acting like it was just another day, but my mind was racing. I had to play this smart, cautious. If I went to my boss too soon, I could end up exposing myself before I fully understood what I was dealing with. Hell, I wasn't even sure who I was dealing with yet. I spent most of the day pretending to work, but my eyes kept drifting to the corner of my screen, where the encrypted files sat. I'd pulled them off the servers last night before leaving, hidden under layers of password protection. They were a mess, fragments of code, erased logs, and file names that didn't match any of our projects. None of it made sense. Every time I tried to piece it together, it felt like someone had scrambled the data just enough to confuse me, but not enough to make it impossible, like it was a game. By lunch, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside. The sun was too bright, the parking lot too empty. It didn't feel real. None of this did. I found myself pacing near my car, staring at the building like it was suddenly foreign to me. How had I worked here for years without realizing something like this was happening right under my nose? I called Tom, one of the few people I trusted at Vanguard. He'd been with the company longer than I had and knew the ins and outs of every system we had in place. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was him. "Hey Tom, got a minute?" I tried to sound casual, but my voice cracked just enough to give me away. "Yeah, what's up?" he asked, his tone neutral. I could hear the clacking of keys in the background, a reminder that while I was spiraling, the rest of the world kept moving. "I found something," I started, hesitating. "It's not good. Unauthorized access to the servers. Someone's been in there for months messing with our data. But it's deeper than that. I think it might be a cover-up." There was a pause, longer than I expected. "What kind of cover-up?" he asked finally, his voice lowering. "You sure about this?" "I'm still trying to piece it together," I admitted. "But I've seen enough to know it's not just a breach. They're hiding something big, and it goes back further than we thought." Tom didn't say anything for a moment, and I could feel my pulse quickening, waiting for him to either laugh it off or take me seriously. "You need to be careful, Will," he said finally, his voice tight. "You don't know who's behind this yet, and if you push too hard, you might find yourself on the wrong side of this thing." I hung up, feeling more uneasy than before. Tom wasn't the kind of guy to spook easily. If he thought there was something dangerous here, then maybe I was in over my head. Still, I couldn't let it go. There was too much at stake. I couldn't just walk away from it, pretend I hadn't seen the cracks in the system. Back at my desk, I opened the files again, ignoring the knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like every keystroke was being tracked, every click monitored. But maybe that was just paranoia setting in. Either way, I had to keep digging. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to ignore the nagging sense of paranoia creeping up on me. The data, the log files, the erased entries, they all blurred together after hours of combing through them, but I wasn't any closer to finding the truth. Every time I thought I was onto something, it slipped through my fingers like sand. Whoever was behind this, they were good, real good. Tom's warning echoed in my head. "You don't know who's behind this yet." That was the part that got to me. It wasn't just the breach or the manipulation of data, it was the sense that I was playing a game I didn't understand, and the other side had a head start. But I couldn't walk away. I should have walked away, but something kept me going, kept me glued to that screen, chasing shadows. Maybe it was ego, or maybe it was fear. Fear that if I didn't figure this out, I'd become part of the cover-up too, another name buried under layers of classified reports. It was late. Most of the office had cleared out by now, the usual hum of conversation replaced by the occasional tap of a distant keyboard. I should have gone home, but I couldn't. Not yet. I opened another log file, this one from a few weeks ago, and saw the same pattern. Unauthorized access in the dead of night, files accessed that shouldn't have been touched. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the user IDs wasn't entirely unfamiliar. I'd seen it earlier, buried in the mountain of logs. At first I thought it was just another random string of numbers, but now it stood out, CT456 to 12. I clicked through a few more entries, my pulse quickening. The same ID popped up over and over again, attached to different access points, different times. Whoever this was, they were inside the system, deep inside. My mind raced. How could someone be accessing this level of data without triggering alarms? And how long had they been doing this? I pushed back from the desk and ran a hand through my hair, my thoughts spinning out of control. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to trace the ID back to its source. But something stopped me. What if this was a trap? What if they wanted me to find this, to follow the trail right into whatever they'd set up? The room felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls were pressing in, and I realized my breathing had picked up without me noticing. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of the door behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Slowly, I turned my head just enough to see the faint outline of someone standing in the doorway, backlit by the glow of the hallway lights. "Working late, Carter?" The voice was calm, too calm, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I recognized it immediately. David Hayes, my supervisor. He was standing there, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "Yeah," I managed to say, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked just enough to betray me. "Just finishing up some routine checks." I clicked out of the logs, pulling up a meaningless spreadsheet, hoping he hadn't seen what I was really doing. Hayes stepped into the room, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "Routine checks, huh?" He walked over to my desk, glancing at the screen. "We've all been putting in extra hours lately. Lot going on with these new contracts." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, seems like it." He didn't leave. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes scanning the room. "You're one of the best we've got, Carter. Always thorough." There was something off in his tone, something that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't place it. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, and I flinched, just a little, but enough for him to notice. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost concerned. But I could feel the tension underneath. He knew. He had to know. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He lingered a moment longer before nodding. "Get some rest. Don't burn yourself out." And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and a growing pit in my stomach. I stared at the door long after he left, the quiet hum of the office suddenly feeling more ominous than it ever had before. I sat there for what felt like hours after Hayes left, my hands hovering over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. Every instinct screamed at me to shut everything down, walk out of the office, and forget I ever found that access log. But it was too late for that. He knew I was onto something, and now I had no choice but to see this through. The question was, how far did this go? And more importantly, how many people were in on it? My thoughts kept drifting back to that user ID, CT456-12 store. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just some random string of characters. It had a pattern to it, something deliberate. I opened a private window and started a trace on it, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere that would make this all make sense. As I waited for the results, I couldn't stop replaying my interaction with Hayes. The way he stood over me, calm, almost friendly, but there was something behind his words. Like he knew exactly what I was doing, but was giving me enough rope to hang myself with. The trace came back with a result, and my heart skipped a beat. The user ID wasn't random at all. It was tied to an internal account, one that had been granted special clearance, higher than anything I'd ever seen. This wasn't just a rogue employee poking around. This was someone with deep access, someone operating from within Vanguard itself. And it wasn't just one person. I kept scrolling through the logs, watching as other IDs popped up, all tied to the same cluster of servers, all accessing highly classified information. My stomach turned as the realization hit me. This wasn't just some random breach. This was deliberate, planned. I was looking at an entire network of unauthorized activity, and it was all happening right under our noses. I stood up, pacing the small office, trying to wrap my head around what I'd uncovered. What was the end game? What were they after? I pulled up my phone, my fingers shaking as I texted Tom. "We need to talk. It's bigger than we thought." My thumb hovered over the send button, but before I could press it, my phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed across the screen. "Hello," I answered, my voice sounding far more anxious than I intended. "Carter." It was Hayes. His voice was cold, stripped of the fake concern from earlier. "I think we should have a conversation." I felt my mouth go dry. "About what?" "About what you're doing," he said, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Meet me in my office in 15 minutes. Don't be late." The line went dead, and I stood there, staring at my phone like it had turned to stone in my hand. This was it. They knew. They'd been watching me, waiting for me to dig just deep enough, and now I was trapped. I glanced around the room, my pulse hammering in my ears. 15 minutes wasn't long. If I was going to do something, I had to do it now. I grabbed my bag, stuffing my laptop inside, along with whatever notes I had on the breach. My hands were slick with sweat, trembling as I fumbled with the zipper. I needed to get out of here. I wasn't going to Hayes' office. Not now. Not ever. Whatever was going on, I had a feeling I was walking straight into a setup, and I wasn't going to be the fall guy for this. I slung the bag over my shoulder and headed for the door, glancing back at the office one last time before I stepped out into the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. I walked out of the building without looking back. Every step felt heavier than the last, like I was dragging the weight of everything I just uncovered with me. The air outside felt colder than it should have for this time of year, biting at my skin as I moved toward my car. My phone was still clenched in my hand, Hayes' voice echoing in my head. "I think we should have a conversation." No, we definitely shouldn't. Not anymore. I got into my car, slamming the door behind me, the sudden silence inside almost disorienting. My fingers hovered over the ignition for a second before I turned the key. I didn't even know where I was going, just that I needed to be far away from here. Maybe I could reach out to Tom again, tell him what was really going on. But that would mean dragging him into this, too. What if they already had him under surveillance? What if he was a part of it? I shook the thought off and pulled out of the parking lot, trying to act as normal as possible, even though my pulse was hammering in my neck. The roads felt darker, emptier, as I drove further from Vanguard. I couldn't help but feel like there were eyes on me, watching my every move. My mind kept replaying the trace, the logs, the sudden call from Hayes. It was all happening too fast. How long had they known I was digging? Was this the plan all along, to let me get just close enough before they reeled me in? The freeway stretched ahead of me, endless and empty. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel. I knew I couldn't keep running like this forever. But the thought of going to the authorities, of exposing everything, I didn't even know where to start. I was a cybersecurity analyst, not some whistleblower, and who would believe me anyway? Without solid proof, I was just another paranoid guy with a wild conspiracy theory. Suddenly, my phone lit up with a text. It was from Tom. "Where are you? We need to talk." My stomach dropped. He never texted like that, never so direct. I stared at the message, my mind spinning. Was it a trap? Had Hayes already gotten to him? Or was he trying to warn me too? I didn't respond. Instead, I turned off the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat, trying to focus on the road. But the more I drove, the more I realized there wasn't a safe direction to go. I was trapped between whatever scheme Vanguard was running and the people they had working inside, the ones who knew exactly what I was trying to uncover. Then it hit me. The logs, the altered files. They hadn't just been hiding data, they'd been planting it. The trace I'd followed, the clues I thought I'd found on my own, they'd wanted me to find them. They'd led me straight into this. I wasn't uncovering a conspiracy, I was part of it. A scapegoat, the breach, the unauthorized access. It was all fabricated to lead back to me, to make it look like I was the one behind it all. My grip tightened on the wheel, panic rising in my chest. I was driving straight into a trap, one they'd been setting for months. And now Hayes was waiting, just waiting for me to make the next move so they could pull the trigger. I pulled off the road, parking in an empty lot under a flickering streetlight. My breathing was shallow, heart racing as I tried to think. There was no way out. They'd planned everything. They'd been watching every step I took, controlling it from the beginning. And now I was right where they wanted me, alone, isolated, with nowhere to turn. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, the silence pressing in around me. For the first time, I realized the truth. I wasn't the one uncovering anything. I was just the bait. I hadn't spoken to Thomas in over a year when I got the call. Dead. Just like that. It was supposed to be an accident. Car ran off the road, flipped over a guardrail. But something didn't sit right. Thomas wasn't the type to lose control, especially not behind the wheel. The guy was meticulous. Too meticulous for that. The funeral was small, barely anyone there. Just a couple of his coworkers from the GSA and a few family members I didn't recognize. It felt hollow, like there was a weight hanging over everyone, but no one dared acknowledge it. A week later, I got the package. No return address, just my name scrawled in Thomas's messy handwriting. Inside were documents, notes, all kinds of information about his last job. He'd been working as a contractor for the GSA, something about managing infrastructure projects. But the more I dug into his notes, the clearer it became that Thomas had uncovered something big. There were lists of inflated costs, contracts that didn't match up, and mentions of high-level meetings that weren't supposed to happen. It hit me. Thomas didn't die in an accident. He'd been silenced. I couldn't just let this go. Every part of me wanted to shove the documents back in the envelope and forget I ever saw them. But I owed Thomas. He was the one who dragged me out of my worst days as a detective, stuck by me when I fell apart. And now he was dead because he stuck his nose where it didn't belong. If I didn't pick up where he left off, no one would, and that didn't sit well with me. I started by retracing his steps. Most of the names in his notes were redacted, but I recognized a few key players. The first was a guy named Simmons, one of the higher-ups at the GSA. I knew that name from some previous work. Always clean, never left a trail. But if Thomas had his name in the notes, it meant he was involved. I made a few calls, asking around quietly. The responses were cagey, but one thing was clear: Simmons didn't want to be found. Days turned into weeks, and every door I knocked on either got slammed in my face or led to more dead ends. But I couldn't stop. The more I dug, the more pieces started to come together. There were shell companies tied to the GSA, funneling money into projects that didn't exist. The contractors were ghosts, the paperwork falsified, but the money was real, moving in massive amounts. It was a classic case of corruption, the kind I'd seen 100 times before, but something felt off. It was too clean, too well orchestrated. Then I found the email. Buried deep in Thomas's files was a single message from a nameless account. Stop digging, or you'll end up like the rest. Simple, to the point, and threatening enough to make anyone back off. But not Thomas, and certainly not me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I left my apartment, I felt eyes on me, like someone was waiting, observing from the shadows. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia, the kind that comes from diving into things you're not supposed to know. But the feeling stuck, clinging to me like a second skin. It wasn't just in my head. I knew the signs, subtle movements in my peripheral vision, cars idling a little too long at the curb. They were keeping tabs on me, just like they had on Thomas. One evening, I was heading back to my place after following another dead lead when I saw it. A black sedan parked a few houses down from mine, engine running. My pulse quickened. I knew it wasn't just some random neighbor waiting for a friend. It was deliberate. They weren't trying to hide anymore. I hesitated at the corner, pretending to check my phone, but my mind was racing. Do I confront them, or do I keep moving, pretend I haven't noticed? I wasn't ready for a showdown. Not yet. I ducked into the alley, taking a longer route home. Let them watch my empty apartment for a while. Inside, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. My apartment felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in. Every sound outside made me jump. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, it all sounded louder, more sinister in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of Thomas's files. This was bigger than I thought, and now I was in deeper than I'd ever intended. I could stop, walk away before things got worse, but I couldn't leave it. Not after Thomas, not after everything I'd uncovered. The next day, I decided to pay Simmons a visit. The man had been dodging me for weeks, but I knew where he worked, and if there was one thing I learned in my years as a detective, it was that people like Simmons thrived in predictable environments. He wouldn't expect me to come straight to him. When I walked into the GSA offices, it felt like stepping into enemy territory. Fluorescent lights, polished floors, employees moving around like nothing was wrong. But I knew the truth. This place was rotten to the core. "Can I help you?" The receptionist looked up, eyes narrowing slightly as she scanned me. "I'm here to see Simmons," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Tell him it's Max Davis." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a moment I thought she might call security. But then she nodded. One moment. She picked up the phone, murmuring something before hanging up. "He's in a meeting," she said, voice flat. "But you can wait." I nodded and took a seat in the lobby, my eyes flicking to the security cameras mounted in the corners. This was a game, and Simmons was already one step ahead. I could feel it. I waited in that lobby for what felt like hours, though it was probably just 20 minutes. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly, blending into the distant buzz of office chatter. My eyes were glued to the hallway, waiting for Simmons to show his face. I didn't care if I was being obvious. I needed answers, and I wasn't leaving until I got them. My legs started bouncing, the kind of restless energy that came when I knew things were about to take a turn. I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. When he finally emerged, Simmons didn't look surprised to see me. His eyes flicked over me once, calculating, before he waved me over with a fake smile. "Max," he said, his voice cool, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah, I'm sure you didn't," I replied, standing up and walking toward him. I could feel the tension coiling between us, like a rubber band stretched too tight. "We need to talk." He raised an eyebrow, glancing around like we were about to cause a scene. "Let's take this to my office," he said, gesturing toward the hallway. I followed him, my senses on high alert. Something about the way he moved, the way he didn't even bother with small talk, it was off. Simmons was hiding something, and I was going to find out what. His office was sterile, almost too neat, papers stacked perfectly on his desk, a computer humming softly in the corner. He motioned for me to sit, but I didn't. I stayed standing, watching him as he closed the door behind us. He turned, leaning against the desk, crossing his arms like he was settling in for a casual chat. "Cut the crap, Simmons," I said, my voice low. "I know about Thomas. I know about the files he had on the GSA." He didn't flinch. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Max. Thomas was a paranoid man. He saw conspiracies everywhere." My hands clenched into fists. "He was murdered, Simmons, and I think you know something about it." Simmons gave a half smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Murdered? Thomas had a heart attack. That's what the coroner said." I took a step forward, my pulse quickening. "And you expect me to believe that? After everything he found? After the projects he was looking into?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his expression. It was quick, barely there, but it was enough. "You should drop this, Max," he said, his voice harder now. "Whatever you think you know, it's not worth it." "Not worth it?" I laughed bitterly. "Thomas was my friend. I'm not going to just walk away." Simmons sighed, pushing off the desk. "You don't understand what you're getting into," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "This goes deeper than you think, deeper than even Thomas realized." My stomach dropped. There it was, the crack in his armor. "What are you saying?" He hesitated, looking at the door as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas wasn't killed because of what he found about the GSA. That was nothing compared to what's really going on." I stared at Simmons, trying to process what he was hinting at. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "What's deeper than the GSA?" He glanced at the door again, his face showing a mix of fear and resignation. "Thomas was onto something much bigger," he said. "Something that the GSA is involved in, but it's not just about money laundering. It's about power and control." My heart raced. "What are they planning?" Simmons rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with his next words. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but..." He took a deep breath. "There's a project within the GSA, something they've been working on for years. It's not public knowledge, but it involves underground facilities, deep underground." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What for?" He looked at me, his eyes weary. "They're creating a network of hidden bunkers, not just for storage, but for developing new weapons, biological agents, things that could be catastrophic if they were ever released." The gravity of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. "Are you saying Thomas found out about this?" Simmons nodded slowly. "He did. He was closing in on the full details, but he made enemies. Powerful enemies. They had to silence him before he could blow the whistle." My mind raced. "And you're telling me this because..." "Because," Simmons said quietly, "you're already in too deep. If you keep digging, they'll come after you next." Thomas's death wasn't just an accident, it was a message. A pit formed in my stomach. The thought of walking away seemed impossible now. I had come this far, and the weight of Thomas's death demanded justice. But facing this new revelation felt overwhelming. The idea of hidden weapons, biological agents, it was beyond anything I had imagined. "I can't just drop this," I said firmly. "There has to be something I can do." Simmons's face was grim. "There might be, but you need to be careful. They're watching every move you make. Before I could respond, he stood and walked to the door, opening it slightly to peer into the hallway. "Meet me tonight," he said, lowering his voice. "I'll give you more details, but you need to stay out of sight." He left quickly, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The information he shared was like a puzzle I couldn't put down. I had to find out more, but I knew the risks. Every step I took from now on was a step into danger, and I was no longer just solving a mystery. I was trying to prevent a catastrophe. I met Simmons in a dimly lit diner just outside Albuquerque. He was already seated in a booth in the back, hunched over a cup of coffee. When I slid into the seat across from him, his eyes darted around as if expecting someone to follow. His face was lined with stress, a stark contrast to the calm demeanor he tried to project. "I'm here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's the next step?" Simmons took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred his coffee. "I managed to get hold of some documents that might help you," he said, sliding a manila folder towards me. "But you need to understand this. The GSA isn't just hiding their tracks. They're setting up a whole system for themselves. This project you're dealing with isn't just about weapons, it's about control." I opened the folder and glanced at the papers inside. They were dense with bureaucratic jargon, but a few key terms stood out: Project Atlas, underground facilities, and biological development. The realization that these documents were not just theoretical was chilling. Simmons leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You need to find the original files on Project Atlas. They're stored in a secure server at the GSA headquarters. I know the location, but breaking in will be risky." I looked up from the documents. "Why are you helping me? You're clearly afraid. What's in it for you?" He swallowed hard. "I owe it to Thomas, and if you're caught, they'll come for me too. I've seen what they're capable of. I'm trying to buy us both some time." The weight of his words sank in. The sense of impending danger was palpable. I had to tread carefully, knowing that every move I made could trigger a chain reaction. "How do I access this server?" Simmons handed me a scrap of paper with a location and a time. "There's a delivery service that comes through the back of the GSA building every night. You can slip in through their loading dock. The server room is on the second floor. Just be quick and stay out of sight." I nodded, taking the paper and slipping it into my jacket. "I'll do it tonight, but if this is as big as you say, how can we be sure this won't blow up in our faces?" Simmons' expression grew grim. "We can't be sure, but if we don't act, there's a chance it's already too late. Just remember, stay sharp and trust no one." As I left the diner, my mind raced with the implications of what I was about to do. The idea of infiltrating a government facility to uncover hidden weapons and a biological threat was more than just dangerous. It felt like stepping into a nightmare. I had no choice but to proceed, knowing that the stakes were higher than ever. The truth was out there, and I was about to confront it head-on with the looming shadow of an unknown but unmistakable threat hanging over me. When I first noticed the discrepancies, I shrugged them off as minor clerical errors. I mean, mistakes happen all the time, right? A missing timestamp here, an extra code entry there. But as I sat in my office late one night, going through routine network logs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Numbers weren't adding up, and certain reports seemed to contradict each other. I rubbed my eyes and leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen like it might explain itself. Could it just be a glitch? I muttered, trying to convince myself. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. This wasn't a random bug in the system. This was deliberate. The next morning, I ran a search on our internal network. Nothing too obvious, just a general query that would pull up any unusual patterns in data flow. The results came back in seconds, and there it was, a strange increase in outbound encrypted communications. At first glance, it looked like normal encrypted traffic, routine messages between divisions, but the volume didn't make sense. And the destinations? They weren't NSA channels. I pushed my chair away from the desk, heart racing. I'd been at the NSA long enough to know what encrypted traffic should look like, and this was off, way off. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was above my clearance level, or maybe I didn't have the full picture. Still, something gnawed at me. I needed to dig deeper, but I had to be careful. If I was wrong, I'd be the paranoid engineer chasing ghosts. If I was right, well, I didn't want to think about that just yet. By the end of the day, I couldn't let it go. I waited until the office cleared out, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me the only sound. I pulled up the communications logs again, focusing on the encryption signatures. Each one had a unique marker, almost like a fingerprint. The more I cross-referenced, the more they all pointed to a specific server, one that wasn't supposed to exist. Who the hell is behind this? I whispered to myself, my palms growing slick with sweat. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to report this and let someone else handle it. But I knew I couldn't. I'd found something that wasn't supposed to be found, and now I was in too deep. I made the decision right then. Tomorrow, I'd take this up the chain. Someone had to know. Someone would have answers. But as I shut down my computer and grabbed my coat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just opened a door I wouldn't be able to close. The next morning, I walked into the office with a plan. I'd report the anomalies to my direct supervisor, lay out the facts, and let him take it from there. I had the logs printed out, the odd server highlighted. Simple, right? But as soon as I sat down at my desk, the air felt different. Colleagues were chatting like usual, but there was an edge to it, something just below the surface. Maybe it was just my own nerves getting the best of me, but the longer I sat there, the more it gnawed at me. I took a deep breath and headed for my supervisor's office. Bill was a straight shooter, the kind of guy who didn't entertain conspiracy theories or wild accusations. I knocked lightly and stepped inside. He didn't look up from his screen, just waved me in. "Bill, I've found something weird in the system logs," I began, holding out the papers. "It doesn't add up. There's encrypted traffic going to a server that shouldn't be there, and I think—" He cut me off before I could finish. "Wesley, I'm going to stop you right there." His tone was flat, almost too casual. "I know what you're talking about. Leave it." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "Leave it? Bill, this looks serious. There's unauthorized traffic." "I said leave it," he repeated, this time with a finality that hit me in the gut. His eyes finally met mine, but there was something off. They weren't Bill's eyes, at least not the Bill I'd worked with for years. They were hard, cold. "This is above your pay grade. Walk away." I stood there, stunned. Was he in on it, or was this fear? I couldn't tell. Every fiber of my being told me to argue, to push back, but something in his expression warned me to keep my mouth shut. I gave a stiff nod, mumbled something about just wanting to be sure, and left his office feeling more confused than when I went in. Back at my desk, my hands shook as I logged into the system again. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't let it go. It was too big, too wrong, but I wasn't stupid. If Bill was telling me to walk away, that meant whatever I'd stumbled onto was dangerous. People didn't cover up nothing. I clicked through more logs, trying to find a thread I hadn't pulled yet. My eyes scanned the screen, but my brain was spinning. Had I just put a target on my back? I thought about Bill's face again, the way he'd shut me down. Something about the way he said above your pay grade rattled me. He wasn't warning me to stay away for my own good. He was telling me someone else was watching. A shadow passed over my screen, and I looked up to see a man I didn't recognize standing in front of my cubicle. "You're Turner, right? Bill wanted me to let you know that you've been reassigned for the day. We've got a backlog on the threat analysis queue." "Reassigned?" I repeated, dumbfounded. "Yeah, just a temporary thing. Shouldn't take more than a day or two." His smile didn't reach his eyes, and he left before I could ask any questions. My stomach churned. I was being moved. Not fired, not even reprimanded, just quietly shuffled away from my own work. That's when it hit me. They knew. Whoever was behind this, they knew I'd found it, and now they were watching me. The rest of that day dragged by, every second heavier than the last. I tried to focus on the threat analysis queue they dumped on me, but my mind kept wandering back to the logs. The encrypted traffic, Bill's warning, the man who showed up at my desk with that fake smile. It was all too coordinated, too deliberate. Someone was making sure I didn't get close, and that realization planted a gnawing fear deep in my gut. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, tracking my movements, listening to my conversations. Every time I looked up from my screen, it felt like someone in the office was watching, though no one ever seemed to be. Paranoia? Maybe. But I wasn't just imagining this. Bill's cold, clipped tone when he shut me down, that guy reassigning me on the spot. It was clear I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to. The question was, how deep did it go? And what would happen to me if I didn't let it go? By lunch, I decided to take a walk. I needed to clear my head, or at least pretend I was. The NSA campus felt different that day, like there was an invisible line I'd crossed. I walked the familiar paths, hands in my pockets, my mind racing with the thought that every step I took might be monitored. They had access to everything: phone calls, emails, security cameras. If they wanted to bury me, they could. I found myself standing by the cafeteria window, staring out over the parking lot. I could see my car from here, the one familiar thing that felt safe. For a second, I thought about just leaving, getting in and driving as far as I could. But where would I go? What would I even say if I tried to blow the whistle? Hey, I think the NSA is compromised. That would go well. I'd be lucky if I wasn't locked up in some black site within the hour. A voice snapped me out of it. You good, Wesley? It was Derek from IT standing there with his tray, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. Just taking a break. He gave me a look, one that lasted a little too long, then shrugged. All right, man. See you around. As he walked off, I couldn't help but wonder if even casual encounters like that were being watched. Were they testing me? Seeing if I'd break? If I'd talk to someone I shouldn't? Back at my desk, I was on autopilot. The reports blurred together as I mindlessly clicked through them, pretending to do the work they'd shoved me into. I was too deep in my own head, too wrapped up in the growing sense of isolation. Bill wasn't going to help me. Nobody here would. If anything, I was just waiting for the next shoe to drop. Then, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something in me said to answer. Hello? My voice came out more cautious than I intended. There was a pause. Then, a man's voice, low and calm. Wesley Turner, stop looking, or you'll regret it. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, heart racing. The phone call was the tipping point. I was no longer just dealing with internal anomalies. I was tangled in something dangerous, something beyond the scope of my regular duties. I spent the rest of the day trying to get my bearings, but the weight of that warning sat heavily on my shoulders. The sense of being watched morphed into a tangible threat. The drive home felt interminable. Every car behind me seemed like a tail, every pedestrian a potential spy. My heart thudded in my chest with each red light, every stop sign a reminder of how exposed I was. I replayed the man's voice in my head. His calm tone belied the gravity of his words. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I was in over my head. This was not just about dodging a couple of security breaches. It was about confronting an entire network of deceit. When I finally reached my apartment, the security of my front door felt like a flimsy barrier. I locked it behind me and took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I walked through the empty space, the stark, impersonal walls now feeling like a cage. I tried to think clearly, to devise a plan. But the more I thought about it, the more overwhelmed I felt. If the NSA was compromised, who could I trust? I decided to start by reviewing everything I'd gathered so far. The log files, the encrypted messages. Maybe there was something I had missed, a pattern I hadn't seen. I spread everything out on my dining table, the clutter a chaotic mirror of my mind. Hours passed as I pored over every detail, every discrepancy. Nothing made sense, but I kept going. I had to find something concrete, something irrefutable. A knock on the door startled me out of my concentration. I froze, my eyes darting to the small peephole. No one should have been there at this hour. Hesitant, I peered through the lens. I didn't see anyone, but I could sense that someone had been there, maybe just moments before. I felt my pulse quicken. I knew I had to stay calm, but the nagging thought that someone was watching me was almost unbearable. As I turned back to my documents, I heard a soft sound from the hallway. Footsteps, deliberate and slow. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could dial, the footsteps faded away. The silence that followed was louder than any noise. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if there was genuinely something sinister going on. The rest of the night was restless. I tried to focus on the documents, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the strange footsteps, the chilling call, and the unnerving feeling that my apartment was no longer a sanctuary, but a potential trap. I needed answers, and more importantly, I needed to know who was on the other side of that warning. The stakes were higher than I had imagined, and the fear of what might come next kept me on edge. At each sound in the night, amplifying the dread that had begun to creep into my bones. I kept thinking about the storage warehouse in Little Rock. I needed to know if there was a link between the NSA's manipulation and the clandestine operations. As soon as I could, I started making arrangements to visit the site. The feeling of being constantly watched was unsettling, but my resolve was stronger. I had to uncover the truth, no matter what. My drive to Little Rock was tense. I tried to focus on the road, but every rustle of leaves or passing car heightened my anxiety. I couldn't shake the thought that someone was following me. I pulled into a gas station halfway there, and while refueling, I scanned the area for any sign of trouble. A man in a gray hoodie glanced my way and quickly looked away. My instincts told me he might be someone watching me, but I had no way to prove it. When I arrived at the warehouse, the place looked abandoned. The outside was unremarkable, with faded paint and broken windows. I approached cautiously, my senses on high alert. I pulled out the key I had borrowed from an insider, a small, unmarked piece of metal that seemed to fit into every lock in the warehouse. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, bracing myself. The interior was a maze of dusty crates and shadows. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and decay. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a cluttered space filled with boxes marked with various codes. I searched through them, my heart racing with every creak of the wooden floor. Then I found it, a box labeled with a string of numbers that matched one of the codes from the internal reports I had analyzed. I opened the box to find several hard drives, all encrypted. My hands trembled as I took one out. I knew I needed to get it back to my apartment and crack the encryption to see what was inside. The implications of this discovery were enormous. This could be the evidence needed to expose the entire network of espionage. Just as I was about to leave, a sudden sound jolted me. The unmistakable hum of a car engine came from outside. I hurried to hide behind a stack of crates, my breath quickening. Through a small crack, I saw a black SUV pull up and several men in dark suits step out. They moved with a practiced efficiency that sent shivers down my spine. My heart pounded as I realized they were here for the same reason I was. I had no choice but to leave through the back. As I slipped out, I felt a growing sense of dread. The gravity of the situation hit me. I was up against a sophisticated and ruthless organization. The fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind was now front and center. I had to expose the truth, but the danger was more real than ever. My every move was now crucial. The drive back was fraught with paranoia. Every passing vehicle and every shadow seemed menacing. I felt a heavy burden, knowing that my discovery could alter global dynamics, but also put my life at risk. The stakes were higher than ever. The question wasn't just whether I could reveal the truth, but if I could survive long enough to do so. The warehouse had given me a glimpse of the enormous conspiracy, but the full picture was still out of reach. I was caught in a web of deceit and danger, and the struggle to untangle it had just begun. I thought I had left my old life behind, settled into the quiet rhythms of Topeka. My small house on Elm Street was far removed from the chaos of my days with the CIA. The town was peaceful, almost idyllic, a stark contrast to the high-stakes world I used to navigate. I was finally finding solace in routine until that phone call shattered my tranquility. It was late afternoon when my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw Mark Stevens' name. Mark was a former colleague, someone I hadn't heard from in years. I hadn't expected to hear from him again, let alone under these circumstances. I answered, trying to mask my curiosity with casualness. "Mark, it's been a while. What's going on?" Mark's voice was strained, tinged with a sense of urgency that immediately set me on edge. "Luca, I need your help. There's something going on at the CIA facility I'm working at. Accidents. They're being covered up as technical failures, but I think it's more than that. As he spoke, I could almost picture him, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an anxious frown. He was talking about a series of accidents at a high-security testing facility where the CIA was supposedly developing new weapons. The fact that he called me and the desperation in his voice suggested that this was serious. "What kind of accidents?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rising tension. Mark's response was clipped. "They're not just random. People are getting hurt, and the cover-ups are getting deeper. I think they're testing chemical and biological agents, but it's not just about weapons, it's something darker." A chill ran down my spine. I had seen enough to know that when something was being covered up with such urgency, it often meant something more sinister was at play. "Why come to me?" I asked. "Why not report it through proper channels?" He hesitated before answering, "Because the proper channels are compromised. I need someone who knows how to dig beneath the surface, someone who can be discreet and effective. I need you, Luca." His words hung in the air as I processed the gravity of his request. The thought of returning to that world of shadows and secrecy, a world I had tried to escape, was both unsettling and irresistible. The pull of duty, the urge to uncover the truth, was stronger than my desire for peace. "All right, Mark, I'll help. Give me the details." As I hung up the phone, I felt a wave of unease. The quiet of Topeka seemed to close in on me, as if the walls of my home were suddenly too thin. I knew this decision would pull me back into a web of danger and deception, but there was no turning back now. I had been drawn back into a fight I thought I had left behind, and I was determined to see it through, no matter where it led. I drove to the address Mark had given me, a remote facility on the outskirts of town, hidden behind layers of security that made it clear they were hiding more than just classified projects. My mind was racing as I pulled up to the gate. This place was nothing like the office buildings I had grown accustomed to in my retirement. This was a fortress. The guard at the entrance eyed me with suspicion. I gave him the name of a contact within the facility, a name Mark had provided. "I'm here to see Dr. Lewis," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The guard checked his list, gave me a curt nod, and let me through. As I drove deeper into the compound, I could see the facility was enormous, sprawling over several acres. It looked like a maze of concrete and steel with no windows to speak of. A sense of foreboding settled over me. I'd spent years in similar environments, but something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the heavy security, it was the secrecy, the palpable sense of danger. Dr. Lewis met me at the door of his office, a middle-aged man with a weary expression. He greeted me with a nod and a tight smile. "Mr. Romano, I assume. Let's get to the point. Mark's been in touch with me about these so-called accidents. He believes you can help us." His office was sterile, with minimal decor, an environment designed to keep distractions at bay. He handed me a folder filled with documents. "These are the reports on the incidents. I want you to look through them and tell me what you think. Mark's convinced there's more going on here." I skimmed through the pages, noting the inconsistencies. Reports of accidents that seemed oddly specific, almost as if they were engineered. "These don't look like random failures. It's as if someone is pushing for a specific outcome," I said, my voice low. "Have there been any official investigations?" Dr. Lewis shook his head. "The official line is that these are technical failures. But the frequency and the nature of these accidents, they're raising flags. The employees are suffering from symptoms that don't align with the supposed failures." I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me. The fact that there were cover-ups and potentially deadly experiments going on was becoming clearer. "Tell me more about these experiments," I asked. "What exactly are they working on here?" Dr. Lewis hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to overhear. "It's supposed to be crowd control technology, but it's more than that. They're experimenting with chemicals and biological agents. The employees are being exposed, and their health is deteriorating. It's all being brushed aside as coincidence." His revelation hit me like a punch. This was not just about faulty equipment. This was about human lives being sacrificed in the name of progress. "And you think this is just the tip of the iceberg?" Dr. Lewis nodded. "I fear that's the case. There's something much larger at play. but we need concrete evidence to expose it. That's where you come in. The gravity of the situation settled over me like a shroud. I knew I was stepping into a web of deceit and danger. Yet, the idea of exposing the truth and stopping the harm was stronger than the fear. I took a deep breath, readying myself for the investigation ahead. The next steps would be crucial, and I had to be meticulous. If I was going to uncover the truth, I needed to tread carefully and watch my back. I left Dr. Lewis's office with a mix of determination and unease. My mind kept replaying his words, especially about the chemical and biological agents. I had to see the facility for myself, to understand the scope of these experiments. As I made my way to the restricted area, the sterile corridors felt even colder than before, their emptiness echoing the isolation I was starting to feel. The security badge Dr. Lewis had provided got me through the checkpoints. I moved cautiously through the dimly lit halls. The facility's clinical efficiency did nothing to mask the underlying dread. Occasionally, I passed doors marked with warnings, their signs suggesting dire consequences for unauthorized access. The unease intensified with every step. Reaching a nondescript door marked Experimental Labs, I hesitated. The lock clicked open with a whisper. Inside, the air was heavy with the acrid tang of chemicals. The room was cluttered with equipment and vials, all meticulously arranged but clearly used. A workstation in the corner had a stack of notes detailing the experiments. I skimmed through them, my eyes widening as I read about the effects of the chemicals. Hallucinations, severe reactions, and in some cases, complete physiological collapse. The weight of what I was reading hit me hard. These weren't just accidents, they were the byproducts of deliberate experimentation. I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that the employees were being used as human guinea pigs. I had to be careful. If they knew I was snooping around, I'd be in serious trouble. I was lost in my thoughts when a door creaked open behind me. My heart pounded as I quickly hid behind a row of large containers. I held my breath, listening intently. 2 men entered the lab, their voices low and urgent. "The new batch is ready. They're expecting results," one said. "And if the side effects are as bad as last time?" asked the other. "The protocol's in place. We manage the fallout," came the clipped response. The conversation confirmed my fears. They were bracing for more damage. As the men left, I felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about uncovering faulty equipment or mismanagement. It was about exposing a system that valued its experiments over human lives. I had to get this information out, but I also needed to gather more evidence. I turned my attention to the workstations, taking photos and notes. Each discovery deepened my resolve, but also my fear. What I was uncovering was far more sinister than I'd anticipated. I knew my time was running out. The facility's security was tightening, and the risk of getting caught was growing. But the truth needed to come out. I made my way out of the lab, feeling the weight of my discoveries pressing down on me. The next step was crucial, finding a way to safely expose what I had learned. The stakes were higher than ever, and I couldn't afford any missteps. Returning to my small rented house felt like stepping into a cocoon, a brief reprieve from the escalating chaos at the facility. I sat at the kitchen table, photos and notes spread out before me. The implications of what I had uncovered weighed heavily. I needed to piece together a coherent narrative to expose the corruption and atrocities. As I reviewed the documents, my phone rang. The number was unrecognized, but my gut told me it was important. "Luca Romano," I answered cautiously. The voice on the other end was familiar. "It's Peter from the agency. I'm sorry for reaching out like this, but we need to talk." My pulse quickened. Peter had been a colleague, someone I trusted. "What's going on?" I asked. "Meet me at the old diner on the outskirts of town. We can't talk over the phone," Peter said. There was a strain in his voice, a note of urgency that set me on edge. I agreed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting might tip the scales further into danger. The diner was as deserted as ever, the flickering neon sign casting eerie shadows. I found Peter in a booth at the back, his face grim. "What did you find?" he asked as soon as I sat down. I handed him the photos and notes, watching his expression shift from curiosity to horror. I had my suspicions, but this confirms it. They're experimenting with biological agents. The safety protocols are non-existent. They're hiding this from everyone. Peter's hands trembled as he looked through the evidence. We're talking about a massive cover-up, Luca. If they're willing to do this to their own people, there's no telling what they'll do next. We need to get this information to the right channels, but we have to be careful. They're monitoring everything. The tension in the air was palpable. I felt the weight of the responsibility settling on me. So what's the plan? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Peter looked around nervously. We need to contact an investigative journalist or an independent agency that can handle this without drawing too much attention. But we also need to stay under the radar. If they suspect we're onto them, we're both at risk. We made a pact to work together, each of us taking on different parts of the plan. Peter would handle finding a journalist with the right connections, while I would continue gathering more evidence and figure out a secure way to pass it along. As we left the diner, a sense of dread followed me. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep the rot went. That night, sleep evaded me. I kept replaying our conversation and the photos I'd seen. My thoughts were a jumble of fear and determination. The stakes were too high to back out now. If the CIA's plans were as extensive as they seemed, exposing them was not just about bringing down a corrupt organization. It was about preventing a catastrophe that could affect millions. I had to find a way to ensure the truth came out, no matter the cost. In the days following my meeting with Peter, the urgency of our mission consumed every waking moment. I kept myself hidden, using old contacts to gather additional evidence, while Peter worked to find a journalist who could handle the sensitive information. We had to be careful, navigating a landscape where every misstep could be fatal. One evening, after another long day of digging through files and covertly interviewing former employees, I received a message from Peter. "Meet me at the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. I've got news." The message was brief, but the gravity of it was clear. I felt a chill run through me as I grabbed my coat and left. The warehouse loomed large and derelict under the pale light of the moon. Inside, Peter was waiting, his face etched with anxiety. "We have a problem," he said before I could even ask. "I contacted a journalist, someone who could help expose everything. But now, the CIA knows we're onto them. They're tightening their grip, and we're both in danger." "What do you mean, tightening their grip?" I asked, my heart racing. Peter handed me a folder. Inside were photos of us from various locations, taken from what looked like surveillance footage. "They've been following us. They know who we're talking to and what we're doing." I stared at the photos, my stomach churning. "So what now? How do we proceed?" Peter's expression hardened. "We need to act fast. I've arranged a secure meeting with the journalist, but we need to be cautious. They might already know about this meeting." We devised a plan to meet the journalist in a remote location, away from prying eyes. As we drove to the rendezvous point, an unsettling sense of paranoia gripped me. Every car that passed seemed like a potential threat. The shadows on the road felt menacing, each one a possible trap. When we arrived at the designated spot, a small, isolated cabin, I saw the journalist waiting by a dimly lit porch. As we approached, a voice crackled over the radio in Peter's car. "We've got incoming. Be on high alert." The message was clear. Our time was running out. Just as we were about to approach the journalist, headlights appeared in the distance. The car moved slowly, purposefully. I turned to Peter, panic rising. "We need to get out of here, now!" But before we could react, the car stopped, and several armed men emerged. In a frantic scramble, Peter and I dashed into the woods surrounding the cabin. The sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed behind us. My breath came in short gasps as we ran, the weight of our perilous situation sinking in. We had been outmaneuvered, and now we were not just fighting to expose the truth, but to survive. Back at my small house, with the door locked and the blinds drawn, I tried to piece together what went wrong. The CIA's reach was more extensive and dangerous than I had imagined. Every move we made, every plan we set in motion, was being thwarted. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always one step ahead. The night brought little rest. As I lay in bed, I knew that exposing the truth had become a fight not just for justice, but for our lives. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous the game became. I had to stay vigilant, for the stakes had escalated beyond anything I had anticipated. What I once thought was a battle to reveal a scandal now seemed to be part of a larger, more terrifying agenda, one where the cost of failure could be catastrophic for countless others. My name is Michael Schofield, and for the past decade, I've been digging into stories that most people would rather ignore. I've covered corruption, fraud, and the occasional scandal, but nothing prepared me for what I stumbled upon in Kansas City. It started with a series of deaths. Official reports labeled them as suicides or accidents. Tragic, but not unusual. Except there was something that didn't sit right with me. I was reviewing public records for a different story when I noticed the names of these deceased FEMA employees. They were all linked to high-stress emergency operations. The pattern was too neat to ignore. What kind of suicide happens in such close succession among a specific group of people? I made a few discreet calls. Most people were reluctant to talk, and those who did barely scratched the surface. But one evening, as I was sifting through documents at my small apartment, a contact from FEMA reached out. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, barely above a whisper. "You're onto something, Michael. It's bigger than you think." That's when I saw the first real clue. Hidden among the official reports was a stack of files marked confidential. The papers detailed a project under the guise of enhancing disaster response. The technology discussed was impressive: new communication tools, advanced mapping systems, but something was off. The files mentioned experimental protocols and tests. Why would such sophisticated tech require secrecy and extensive testing on employees? My investigation led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The building had been repurposed into a high-security testing facility, but no one knew it existed until I stumbled across it. The place was eerily quiet, with surveillance cameras fixed in every corner. A faint hum of machinery was the only sound. I felt as if the walls were closing in, the weight of what I might uncover pressing down on me. I broke into the facility that night, a decision I regret to this day. Inside, I found lab reports and documents that detailed a program I could hardly believe. FEMA wasn't just testing technology. They were experimenting with new forms of psychological control. The staff members who had died were part of a cover-up, eliminated because they were about to blow the whistle on a sinister scheme. I was horrified. The government wasn't just mishandling emergencies. They were creating tools to control people under the pretense of aid. As I left the warehouse, clutching the damning evidence, the gravity of what I had uncovered began to settle in. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. I was no longer just a journalist. I was now a target. The layers of deception had only begun to unravel, and I knew I had to stay ahead of those who would do anything to keep these secrets buried. The nightmare was only just beginning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of my apartment seemed louder, every shadow more menacing. The documents I'd found were damning, but I couldn't afford to let my guard down. If FEMA wanted to keep these secrets hidden, they wouldn't take kindly to an investigative reporter getting too close. I needed to tread carefully. The next day, I met with an old colleague, Jenna, who had worked with me on several cases. I trusted her instincts and hoped she could provide insight. We met in a dimly lit coffee shop. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with the murmurs of other patrons, but I couldn't shake my paranoia. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for any unfamiliar faces. "Jenna, I need your help," I said, sliding the documents across the table. "This is bigger than I thought. FEMA is hiding something massive." Jenna's eyes widened as she skimmed through the papers, her brow furrowed in confusion and concern. "Michael, this isn't just about faulty equipment. They're experimenting with psychological control. Are you sure about this?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the truth bearing down on me. "It's not just a test. They're conducting covert operations to monitor and manipulate entire populations. The employees who died were silenced because they were about to reveal the truth." Her face grew pale, and she took a deep breath. "If this is true, then we're dealing with a major breach of ethics, not to mention the danger you're in. We need to get this information to the public before it's too late." We started planning our next steps, trying to balance caution with urgency. But as the days passed, the tension mounted. I began noticing things that set my nerves on edge. Strange cars parked outside my apartment, unmarked vehicles trailing me on the way to work. I felt like a rat in a trap, constantly on edge. One night, as I was reviewing more documents, my phone rang. It was an encrypted call from an anonymous source. "Michael, you need to stop digging. They know you're onto them. The more you expose, the more danger you're in. They're watching you." I was terrified. My hands trembled as I hung up the phone. The paranoia was suffocating. I tried to stay focused, but the fear was relentless. I knew I had to act fast, but the more I uncovered, the more it felt like I was walking into a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. With Jenna's help, we began reaching out to trusted journalists and activists, hoping to find allies who could help us get the story out. But every attempt to share the truth seemed to be thwarted by unseen forces. The deeper we dug, the more I realized how far-reaching this conspiracy went. The threat was no longer just to my career, it was to my life. I knew I was getting closer to something dangerous, but I didn't anticipate how quickly things would spiral out of control. I had arranged a meeting with Jenna at her place to go over the latest findings. I arrived at her modest apartment, the low hum of traffic outside, a constant reminder of the world I was trying to expose. Jenna was already there, her face illuminated by the glow of her computer screen. "Michael, you need to see this," she said, her voice tinged with anxiety. She tapped on the screen, revealing a series of documents and reports. These aren't just isolated incidents, they fit a pattern. I leaned in, my heart racing as I scanned the data. There were discrepancies in the reports about the employees' deaths, gaps that couldn't be explained by mere accidents or suicides. The more I read, the more I realized the scale of what we were dealing with. This is bigger than I thought. They're experimenting with more than just control technology. They're creating systems to manipulate and monitor entire populations. As Jenna spoke, the room felt increasingly claustrophobic. My mind raced with the implications. "How are we supposed to prove this?" I asked, feeling the pressure mounting. Every lead seems to disappear before we can get any solid evidence. Jenna's face was etched with concern. "We need something concrete. Witnesses, documents, anything that ties these deaths directly to FEMA's operations. Otherwise, it's just a theory." I agreed, though the weight of the situation was starting to feel unbearable. We decided to track down former FEMA employees who might have insight into the operation. That evening, as I walked to my car, I felt eyes on me again. The sensation was growing more intense, like invisible hands closing in around me. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The next day, we interviewed a former FEMA worker named Paul. He was hesitant at first, but eventually opened up. "Look, I don't know much," he said, his voice trembling, "but I've seen things that didn't add up. There were always people watching us, making sure we didn't talk about certain projects." Paul's words sent a shiver down my spine. "What kind of projects?" I pressed. He hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but it involved things that weren't supposed to be part of our standard operations. I always felt like there was something more sinister behind it all." Jenna and I left the meeting feeling unsettled. We were piecing together a puzzle that was becoming more horrifying with every new revelation. As we drove back, the paranoia I felt was almost overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. That night, I received another anonymous call. "Michael, you're getting too close. You don't know what you're messing with. They're not just monitoring, they're preparing for something much more sinister. You need to be careful." I hung up, my hands shaking. This was no longer just a story, it was a life or death situation. As I sat in the dim light of my apartment, I realized how deep this rabbit hole went. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the true horror was not just what FEMA was doing, but how far they were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. The weight of what I had uncovered was pressing down on me with increasing intensity. Jenna and I had been working tirelessly to connect the dots, but the deeper we delved, the more dangerous things seemed to become. I found myself staring at the stack of documents on my desk, the words blurring as fatigue set in. Jenna and I decided to split up to cover more ground. She would follow up on leads about the technology being used, while I focused on finding more witnesses. The following day, I met with a former FEMA analyst named Richard. His office was cluttered, with old reports and coffee cups stacked haphazardly. As I entered, Richard looked up from his desk, his eyes wary. "You're Michael Schofield, right? I've heard about your investigation. You're treading on dangerous ground." His voice carried a tremor of fear, and I knew he wasn't just being cautious. I took a seat across from him. "I need to understand what's happening at FEMA. What kind of experiments are they running? Why are people dying?" Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not just about control anymore. It's about creating a system that can manipulate entire populations. They've been testing these technologies under the guise of disaster relief." I felt a chill as his words sank in. "Testing? On whom?" "On us," Richard said. "They've been using employees as guinea pigs for this technology. It's supposed to be a new form of psychological control. The deaths were part of that experiment." I left Richard's office with a sense of dread, knowing that I had to dig deeper. The more I learned, the more I felt like I was being drawn into a web of deceit and danger. Jenna called me later that day, her voice tense. "Michael, we need to meet. I found something alarming." We convened in a dimly lit cafe, away from prying eyes. Jenna handed me a folder filled with classified documents. "These are internal memos. They mention something called Project Sentinel. It's a new program aimed at crowd control. But there's more. They've been working on a system that can influence thoughts and behaviors." As I flipped through the pages, a sense of horror settled over me. This is worse than we thought. They're not just controlling, they're creating a system that can override free will. The cafe felt increasingly suffocating as Jenna and I discussed our next steps. The reality of the situation was hitting hard. "We need to expose this," Jenna said, "but we're up against a powerful organization with resources we can't match." I agreed, but my mind was racing. What if they're already implementing these technologies? What if we're too late? The days that followed were a blur of mounting paranoia and fear. I started noticing things, cars that seemed to follow me, people who appeared to be watching from a distance. It was as if the walls were closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, my every move scrutinized. That night, as I reviewed the documents, I received another anonymous message. It was a single line, "They're closer than you think." My heart pounded as I read the message over and over. It was a warning, but it felt like a threat. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker. The deeper I went, the more I realized the enormity of what was at stake. The technology FEMA was developing could change the world in ways that went beyond our darkest fears. I had to find a way to reveal the truth before it was too late. The race against time was more urgent than ever, and every step felt like a step into a deeper abyss. I spent the next few days feeling like I was walking a tightrope in the dark. Every click of my keyboard, every rustle of paper seemed to echo louder in my small apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, but I had to press on. The documents Jenna had handed me were damning. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, and I knew time was running out. One evening, while sifting through more files, I received a knock at my door. My heart raced as I opened it, but no one was there. Instead, a manila envelope lay on the doormat. I grabbed it, hands trembling, and brought it inside. Inside, I found a note. "You're getting too close. Stop now or suffer the consequences." My blood ran cold. This was a warning, but it only made me more determined. I called Jenna immediately. "We've got to move fast. They're trying to scare us off. I got a threat at my door today." "Michael, this is getting dangerous." Jenna's voice crackled with concern. "We need to get this information out before they make their move. What if they're already using these technologies?" "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I need to confirm a few more details. I have a contact who might have more information." I arranged to meet with Lisa, a former FEMA technician who had been involved in the early stages of Project Sentinel. The meeting spot was a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. The place was nearly empty, with only a few scattered patrons, which made the setting even more unsettling. Lisa arrived looking nervous, her eyes darting around as she took a seat across from me. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "They're watching everyone now. The technology, it's more advanced than you realize. They can manipulate thoughts and behaviors. It's not just crowd control. it's total domination. The enormity of her words was staggering. Why are they doing this? What's their endgame? She glanced around before answering. They're developing a system to control not just individuals, but entire populations. It's supposed to be a global network. The deaths of those employees? That's just the beginning. They're testing on a smaller scale before rolling it out worldwide. Lisa's revelation felt like a punch to the gut. I realized that exposing this was not just about bringing a corrupt operation to light, it was about preventing a global catastrophe. As I walked back to my car, my thoughts were racing. I could barely concentrate. I needed to prepare my report, but something felt off. When I reached my apartment, the door was ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I slowly pushed it open and stepped inside. Everything seemed in place, but a cold draft made the hairs on my neck stand up. On my desk was a single note, handwritten and slightly smudged. "Your curiosity is dangerous. Stop now, or you and those you love will pay the price." I felt a surge of fear, but also a steely resolve. I knew now I was up against something much larger and more sinister than I had ever imagined. My next step was clear. I had to finish my report and get it to the right people. But I also had to be cautious. The technology they were developing could change the world in unimaginable ways, and if I didn't act quickly, it might be too late to stop them. The weight of the truth was crushing, but I had no choice but to face it head on. The clock was ticking, and every second counted.